Welcome everyone to Thursday's edition of our Packers News live chat. Alongside Tom Silverstein, I am Olivia Reiner. The Packers put on their pads for their most intense practice of this week, leading up to Sunday's game against the Detroit Lions. We'll bring you the latest on defensive lineman Kenny Clark's groin injury, and we'll preview some of the offensive matchups for the Packers come Sunday's game in just a moment. However, as always, before we begin, I want to remind you, you can be a part of our conversation. If you're over on Facebook, Periscope, or YouTube, leave us a question, leave us a thought. Tom and I are dying to hear from you. We'll address some of those questions towards the end of our conversation today. Defensive lineman Kenny Clark, for the second straight day, did not practice. He sustained a groin injury in Sunday's game against the Minnesota Vikings that kept him pretty much sidelined for the majority of the game. He only played 15 snaps. The defensive line, Tom, as a whole on Sunday, did not have a very strong game. They let up 154 rushing yards on the ground. Defensive line coach Jerry Montgomery was not happy with the performance of his line as a whole. How, Tom, can the Packers defensive line improve against the run come Sunday, potentially without Kenny Clark?
Well, I don't know if they can improve, but they can try to hold their own. And I think they have to get a little bit more out of Kingsley Keke. He played pretty much all over the defensive line and played over the nose a little bit. And he may have to do more of that on Sunday. Definitely Tyler Lancaster will have to play the nose. And this is assuming Clark doesn't play. And I'd be absolutely shocked if he plays. And then they should get Montrevious Adams back this week. So, he's got to be ready. He's got to jump in there right away and contribute something because, they have a pretty big challenge with Adrian Peterson might be aging, but he just ran for 93 yards against Chicago. So he's not done, that's for sure.
The Packers defensive line is going to be challenged for sure by 14-year veteran running back Adrian Peterson. Tom, as you said, 93 yards on 14 carries on the ground for Peterson on Sunday against the Chicago Bears. How big of a challenge can Peterson be to this defense?
Well, it's not like he's the guy he was 10 years ago or 6 years ago, but he still has enough talent. And then they've got to be a little bit worried about DeAndre Swift, too, who's their draft choice, who they're expecting a lot out of. He is a pretty nice back at Georgia, and he may have dropped the game-winning pass, but the fact that he was open for the game-winning pass tells you something. I think that's a nice combination for them, and if they can kind of get that running game going, then Matthew Stafford just thrives on play action, and I can see him having a lot of time to throw if they're able to run the ball and keep the Packers kind of at bay.
Let's move on, Tom, to some injuries on both the Detroit Lions side and on the Packers side that could have some implications for the offense come Sunday's game against the Lions at Lambeau Field. We'll start there with the Lions secondary. Hamstring injuries have plagued this Lions secondary. 3 cornerbacks, Justin Coleman, Desmond Trufant, and Jeff Okudah, have all been dealing with hamstring injuries. Coleman just recently went on IR. The Packers will not have to face him. Trufant has been battling with his hamstring injury that he sustained in Sunday's game against the Chicago Bears. He did not practice yesterday, and he did not practice today. Okudah, on the other hand, he has been practicing the last 2 days after he sat out of the Week 1 opener, so he'll likely be back against the Packers. He'll be making his debut in Week 2. What does the matchup look like with this Packers wide receiver core against a potentially very battered secondary for the Detroit Lions?
Yeah, Detroit has been trying to remake their secondary. It's really been kind of almost a 2-year process, and they got rid of their top corner, Darius Slay, and sort of, theoretically traded him for Jeff Okudah, who was their top pick and is a phenomenal athlete and was a great corner at Ohio State. He's going to come in, and I think he'll be pretty decent. But it's just like Devontae Adams working against Cameron Dantzler and Mike Hughes. Those are young corners of the Vikings, and he really made them pay. Not having Trufant is a real big loss for them. I think he could have at least followed Devontae Adams around, but they've got a lot of new pieces in that secondary, and so I wouldn't be surprised if LaFleur is looking to attack a lot.
Injuries impacting the Lions secondary, as sort of the injuries have been impacting the Packers offensive line. However, the trends are going in different directions. The offensive line is trending up for the most part. Right tackle Billy Turner, tackle I suppose he was the starting right tackle in Sunday's game. However, traditionally left guard Elton Jenkins and other guard Lucas Patrick have all been dealing with different injuries. They all sustained injuries over the last several weeks. Turner had been dealing with a right knee injury throughout training camp that kept him out of Sunday's game against the Minnesota Vikings. Elton Jenkins sustained an ankle injury. Lucas Patrick sustained a shoulder injury in that game when they started. Now, they returned to practice. They've been practicing in a limited capacity yesterday. Today, they returned to full participation in practice in pads, which has got to be good news there for the Packers. If they are all healthy, Tom, who is the Packers' starting offensive line come Sunday against the Lions?
Well, it's a good question because they have a couple of options at right tackle and play Lucas Patrick at right guard in place of Lane Taylor, who's out for the year. Or they could bump Turner back to his right guard position, the position he played all of last year, 18 games, and put Rick Wagner at right tackle. Rick Wagner had a nice game against the Vikings. He was very solid, and he'll be going against his old teammates, so he knows a lot about the Lions. I think it was interesting at practice that they kept the six guys that essentially make up the starting offensive line, and they were all working together while everyone else was doing a pass rush drill. So in essence, they're saying, we've got six, we'll pick five at some point. And I think that's probably the case. I think they're practicing to see who's ready and who's practicing well, and they'll make that decision when the time comes. But today it was real telling that they kept those six guys together.
Just like last week, head coach Matt LaFleur will be assembling all sorts of offensive line combinations throughout the week until he feels comfortable with a starting five for Sunday's game. Let's move over to our questions over on Facebook, Periscope, and YouTube. If you haven't asked a question yet, don't worry. There's still time for you to get your question in. Leave it in the chat, and we will take a look at some of those right now. Let's start with Michael here. Nice to see you again, Michael. Always a frequent commenter. We appreciate it. What do you see us exploiting the most against the Detroit Lions? Tom, we talked about the Packers wide receivers matchup with the battered Detroit Lions secondary. How likely is it that is the best matchup there for the Packers?
Oh, absolutely. I think we'll see a lot of three wide receiver sets. I think we'll see Valdez-Scantling even more than we did against the Vikings. And then we may see tight ends split out a little bit. I just think they're going to put pressure on the secondary any way they can. I remember in the game out in Detroit last year, they tried so hard to go deep on the Lions. They just kept throwing it deep, and they weren't all that successful and barely won. So I wonder, whether they're going to do that again, or maybe just say, let's be a little bit more balanced, even though there's question marks in the secondary, and there were back then too. Maybe we'll just be a little bit more balanced. So I'm interested to see which way they go.
I'm also interested to see which way they go, Tom. It's a good question, something to keep an eye on come Sunday's game. Thank you, Michael, for your question. Let's take a question here from Steve. Steve asks, could the Packers see Rashawn Gary, outside linebacker, playing more defensive end this week? Rashawn Gary got a good number of snaps there, mixed in with Za'Darius and Preston Smith, even occasionally getting out on Za'Darius Smith. How likely is it that Rashawn Gary gets a few more opportunities this weekend?
Yeah, I think specifically, Steve was asking about him at defensive end, which they did use that with when they had Za'Darius Smith and Preston Smith in the game. He would be lined up. Gary would be lined up inside of one of those two outside linebackers. So I do think we could see some of that. I don't think you want to do that down after down. He's still not a 300-pound defensive end or a 290 defensive end, but he is very strong. And I think we could see more of that, especially if they're not real happy with how some of the D linemen are playing.
Potentially some more opportunities for Rashawn Gary come Sunday's game. We'll keep an eye on that as the game begins on Sunday. Looking forward to the home opener. Thank you, Steve, for the question. Let's bring it back to Michael. Lots of questions from our guy Michael today. We appreciate it. How did the Packers match up against the Lions? We talked about the matchup between the Packers receivers and the Vikings secondary. However, Tom, as a whole, looking back, especially to last season, you think about the two games that the Packers played against the Lions where they didn't lead until the final horn blew to signal the end of the game. And in either of those games, what has changed for the Packers since they last took on the Detroit Lions?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about roster versus roster, I think you would take the Packers roster over Detroit's. They're still in a little bit of a rebuilding mode. But the one area where Detroit could mess things up is if the Packers offensive line remains banged up. If Patrick couldn't play, or Wagner injured his elbow, or Wagner hurt his knee, and all of a sudden Trey Flowers and Jamie Collins and they're gonna bring some heat. So I do think from just a straight matchup standpoint, I think the Packers have a better roster, but there's still some weaknesses where if Detroit can exploit them, or the Packers have some numbers problems, then Detroit could definitely take advantage of it.
Thank you there for your question, Michael. Let's move on to Tommy. Tommy has a Packers signing wish he's putting out into the universe. Perhaps it will come true now because you've asked it on the show. That's how that works. Tommy says, we need snacks, and I'm assuming you're not hungry. I'm assuming you're talking about nose tackle Damon Harrison, who's currently a free agent. He's a former Detroit Lion. Tom, if the Packers have a long-term injury on their hands with Kenny Clark and his groin injury, Montravius Adams has been dealing with some stuff. He's been practicing, so that's good news there for the Packers. However, if that is a significant injury there to Clark, how likely is it that they look outside of the roster and bring a free agent in?
Well, I'm always a little bit wary of a guy who's on Twitter who's campaigning for work. So that kind of tells me that the NFL or people around the league really don't think that he can do it anymore. Either that, or he's asking for too much money. That could be the other possibility. But he seems like he's on Twitter talking about coming back all the time, and for whatever reason, he's not back. So I don't know. They could try to do that. I don't think Kenny Clark's injury is. I think the fact that we saw him at practice on the sideline working out means that it's probably not as bad where he would miss, half the season or something like that. If they have to play without him for 2 or 3 weeks, then that's just something they're going to have to do. I don't know if it's worth signing a guy who has to come in and pass the COVID tests. They have to find out whether he's in shape. There's just a lot of factors there. But, if they had another injury, I could see them definitely thinking about a free agent from the outside.
The nature of this season is such that it's challenging to bring in free agents, make sure they're up to speed, get them COVID tested, all of that in such an odd time, I suppose. However, he's still out there. It is a long season, and you never know exactly what might happen. Perhaps Tommy will have his wish come true. We will see. Thank you for your question. Let's move on to some of our other commenters. We've got a few people in here, both Stanford and Michael, who Stanford wants to hear a little bit more about A.J. Dillon, Packers running back, rookie running back. When will Packers fans get to see more of A.J. Dillon? Michael, the other Michael, also wants to see A.J. Dillon a little bit more on Sunday. Ooh, and even is putting out into the universe that the Packers might use him in a receiving capacity. A.J. Dillon in Boston College, when he was younger, he did not have a lot of opportunities to get involved in the passing game. It was not a responsibility for the running backs. How do you anticipate the Packers using A.J. Dillon going forward for the rest of the season?
Well, it was a really good question because that was sort of addressed this week a little bit. LaFleur said he would have liked to gotten A.J. Dillon some more snaps. But, what happened, in my estimation, is that they were way ahead, and if the defense wouldn't have given up 24 points in the fourth quarter, we would have seen a lot more of A.J. Dillon. They would have brought him in and given him, if they had kept that lead or were up by 19 for most of the half, he would have gotten some carries in the fourth quarter. That would have been the perfect time to get him some looks. In the meantime, they what did he play? 3 snaps, I think, and carried twice. They got to continue to work him in. It was just the first game. I wouldn't make too much out of how little they used him. I think they'll continue to work him in gradually. And if there's a situation where they're way ahead, then I could see them definitely using him, taking Aaron Jones out of the game and using him.
There are certainly opportunities out there for A.J. Dillon to get more involved in this run game. We know head coach Matt LaFleur wants to get him more involved. It's just a matter of how he fits in any given week against what the defense presents on Sunday. So thank you, Michael and Stanford, for your great questions. Let's go back for a third time, maybe a record now, to Michael. Tom, do you think running back / return specialist Tyler Ervin can be a do-it-all difference maker like another wide receiver? I suppose Tyler Ervin now is straddling the wide receiver and running back designation. Desmond Howard, a receiver and a return specialist of the past. How similar can Tyler Ervin's game be to Howard's?
Well, that's so. In order for Tyler Ervin to have the same impact as Desmond Howard, he'd have to break the NFL punt return record, which Desmond Howard did in that 1996 season, and be the Super Bowl MVP. So that's asking a lot. I think, and also Desmond Howard didn't play on offense. He was no factor on offense. Ervin has a chance to be a factor in offense. I thought he was against the Vikings, and he's always going to be a threat. They're going to use him on the jet sweeps, and I think they're going to find ways to get him the ball in the open field because he's really fast. But I don't know. I get what you're saying, and that he could be a bit of a difference maker, but I hesitate to compare him to Desmond Howard because Desmond Howard made a huge difference in the Packers winning the Super Bowl that year.
And Tyler Ervin made a huge difference in the Packers getting out of negative punt return yardage, Tom. You weren't part of the campaign to erect a statue of Tyler Ervin after the season last year, were you?
Yeah. Well, that was pretty impressive. I mean, the first time he touched the ball, I got out of 0 negative yardage on punt returns. So, yeah, he was Sean Menenga's hero.
At the very least, Tyler Ervin will have an increased role in the offense compared to last year, really in any of his stops. in his career. He's been on several different teams, hasn't really been able to stick around for very long. The longest time he was with the team for 2 consecutive seasons was back when he was drafted by the Texans in 2016. So now he's got an opportunity to have a lasting impact on a team for more than just a couple of games, a few games in a short stint. So that is encouraging for Tyler Ervin. Thank you once again, Michael, for your question. Bernard, if you're joining us late, welcome. Bernard wants to know, will Kenny Clark be available on Sunday? That's a very good question. We don't know yet. However, if you missed the beginning of the show, defensive lineman Kenny Clark did not practice for a second consecutive day. He's running out of time. If he gets back to practice tomorrow, I would say that it's a little bit more optimistic that he would play on Sunday. However, right now, the way he's trending, it's not looking likely like Kenny Clark would play. Tom, even if he does practice tomorrow, how likely is it that he would see the field on Sunday?
Unlikely. I just don't see any way he's going to play. I didn't see him doing much today, and I would be really, really, really shocked if he played on Sunday. I would expect they won't have him.
Not so great news there for the Packers defensive line. However, they will have to figure out a way to stop Adrian Peterson, get after Matthew Stafford without Kenny Clark. That is going to do it for us today, everyone. Thank you so much, as always, for joining us. We will be back tomorrow to do one last live stream before our pregame live stream on Sunday at home at Lambeau Field against the Detroit Lions. So if we didn't get to your question today, bring your question back tomorrow, and hopefully we will try to give you a good answer once again. Make sure you're checking us out over on PackersNews.com. We have lots of coverage over there as the Packers gear up for their game against the Lions. Also, make sure you're following us on social media. We have lots of updates throughout the week over there, especially as it relates to injuries. So if you have any questions, you're going to want to make sure that you follow us on all of our social media platforms as well. For Tom, I'm Olivia. We'll see you next time.